This is an overview on how to answer the 16-mark question on Paper 2 British Depth Study. The idea of this overview is that you can find out how to best answer the question so that as you work your way through the questions on the website, you know exactly what you need to do to score as many marks as possible. The question will always be structured exactly like this. They will give you a statement giving an opinion. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. You may use the following in your answer. Stimulus point 1, stimulus point 2. You must also use information of your own. 16 marks. There's a couple of important things you need to remember when answering this question. They're giving you an opinion, so you need to decide whether or not you agree with it. It doesn't really matter if you do or if you don't. The examiner won't have a right answer. The important thing is how you explain your opinion. The second important thing to remember is that you've got to deal with what's called a second-order historical concept. For most of the questions in your history GCSE, that will be determined in advance, so you will know if a particular question will always deal with change or if it will always deal with significance. With this question though, you need to work out which second-order concept they're trying to get you to look at. So those second-order historical concepts could be change, continuity, causation, consequence, significance, or similarity or difference. Taking a minute before you start answering the question to work out which of those they want you to focus on is a really good way to start your answer. As we take a look at the mark scheme, you will notice straight away that AO2, which is worth 10 marks, depends on your analysis and evaluation of that second order concept. Really important that you identify it and make sure that is what your answer is focused on. AO1, which is worth the other 6 marks, is your knowledge and understanding of the period. So with this longer question, it's an opportunity for you to bring in all the knowledge that you have to explain your opinion. Remember that the AOs depend on each other. That means that no matter how well you perform in one of them, if you haven't got any of the other in your answer, then you can't progress to the next band. Now that's a mark ceiling. For example, if you have no AO2 in your answer at all, you just list factors or bits of information that you know, then you can't score any higher than the lowest band. So it's really important that you're giving your information, but you're explaining the relevance to the question, and therefore using both AO1 and AO2 to score as many marks as you can. Now let's take a look at the bottom 2 bands for this question. You'll notice that within each band there are 4 marks available. And on the right hand side there are 3 bullet points, so the examiner will determine how many of those 4 marks you get by looking at those bullet points. The first bullet point is for AO2, the second one is for AO1, and the third one is for AO2 again. Now it's important that you know that the examiner will look at the first 2 bullet points to decide on the first 3 marks. That means that you could get the 4th mark for the final bullet point, and it doesn't matter how well you did in the first 2 bullet points. That means that having a clear argument is really important to boost your marks and push you into the higher bands. Taking the time before you start writing to make sure that your answer is logically structured and that it follows a clear path is a really good way to do that. The first bullet point in the bottom 2 bands will mean that you've answered the question, but your comments are maybe a little bit general. So that means that you've given information, but you haven't really linked it to whether or not you agree with the statement. Your answer might require a little bit more development and a little bit more explanation and detail for the examiner to really understand what you're trying to argue. The middle bullet point on AO1 is all about showing your knowledge and understanding. So maybe you've got a few bits of information, but you might need a little bit more, or it might need to be a bit more relevant to the question. This brings us on to the mark ceiling. Now there isn't one in the bottom band, but for band 2, 3 and 4 there is one. So it says that no more than 7 marks, which is the middle mark within the band, can be awarded if you don't explain your answer beyond the stimulus points. So if all your points are around the stimulus points that they give you in the question, then you can't score above the middle band. So it is really important that you bring in your own knowledge and show that you've got a really good understanding of the topic to push you into the higher bands. To score into the top 2 bands, it's all about analysis. So for AO1, that means bringing in relevant but detailed bits of knowledge to support your view. And for AO2, that means making a point about whether you agree or you disagree, explaining why you think that, and most importantly, linking all of that back to the question. It should be really clear whether you're agreeing with the question or you're disagreeing with the question. The examiner shouldn't have to work too hard to figure out what you're arguing. You want to make it as easy for them as possible. A good way of doing that is to use the point, evidence, explain structure. So make your point. Do you agree or do you disagree? Then give your evidence. So that's when you're bringing in either a stimulus point or some of your own knowledge. Then explain why that supports your view, why that links back to the question. And using that structure can be a really good way to show that you've developed your points, your argument is justified and it's fully explained, and that is how you will score in the top 2 bands. And just another important note, you'll notice again that we've got those mark ceilings, so extending beyond the stimulus points again is important to push up your marks. Let's take a look at an example to see this put into action. So this is from the Richard and John option, and the question asks, the main outcome of the Third Crusade was financial losses in England. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. And your stimulus points are the shipwreck in 1192 and Saladin. As we said earlier, it's important that you first identify the second order historical concept that they're looking for in this question. So here it will be significance. The statement argues that the most significant outcome of the Third Crusade was financial losses. So really you're thinking about how significant financial losses were. Are there any other factors that were more significant or less significant that you could use to support your argument? But overall thinking, was financial loss the most significant outcome? Here are some of the points that you might have made when answering this question. So if you decided to support the statement and say that financial losses were the most significant outcome, then you might have argued, for example, that Richard suffered a shipwreck upon leaving the Holy Land in 1192, which was one of the stimulus points in the question. You've then expanded that by saying that this led to his capture by 2 of his enemies, who held him to ransom for £60,000. This is all about how you develop your point. You could then maybe link it to the next point, where you say that to raise such a large amount of money, the English people suffered the financial consequences. And then you can talk about how that links back to the question, making financial losses the most significant outcome of the crusade. Putting all that together in a point like this shows how you've developed your thinking. You've used a stimulus point, but you've brought in your own knowledge and linked all of that back to the question. It doesn't matter if you chose to agree or disagree with the statement. If you can show that you can develop your thinking like this, you can score in the top bands.